Well, hello everyone. It's Kristi. It is Sunday, and so it is time for Social Science Sunday. I've got a new setup on my mic, and I'm going to tell you, I think it's a little not working out, if I'm honest. Hold on a second. Let me mute this for a quick second. Okay, maybe that's better. I'll have to sort this out. I normally sit. Anyway, doesn't matter. You don't matter. Hi, it's Kristi. It's Sunday. I hope everything is going well wherever it is, whenever it is you are. I think this is a little too bright. A lot of adjustments going on this morning still. Yeah, so today we're going to get nerdy and we're going to talk about language and textual analysis. So this is going to build on, let me explain the connections between this and what we've done before so that they're very explicit. In prior, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Oh, I didn't, okay, didn't mute that at all. Sorry, everyone, I thought I'd muted that before. I'm gonna have to call this out. Anyway, before we get into this, let's review ontology and epistemology, right? So in the social sciences, initially the social sciences were very much influenced by the natural sciences in terms of the structure of the scientific method, the assumptions about how things exist in the world, and that causal relationships are, like real, and insofar as we can observe the physical connections that link causal mechanisms, even if we can't always observe the mechanism itself directly, and that our sensory information, sometimes with instruments to augment it, but basically our sensory information is the most important tool for verifying what exists in the world. And that works very well for the natural sciences because it's a material plane of existence. Things exist materially, and the natural science approach is excellent for observing the natural world and the material world. The challenge, though, comes in what developed later when people started to move to the social sciences, and this assumption about the way things existed began to be questioned. Instead of looking at things as natural and given and manifest and material, we realized that human society has structures that exist in terms of relations between people. And those relations can be power structures, or they can be interpersonal relationships, or they can be, everything from a teacher-student relationship or, dynamic employer-employee, that there are a lot of hierarchies in the world, and that there are ways that society has been structured by individuals, usually individuals with power, who are structuring that world in order to preserve their power, though those structures aren't given. They're not natural. They're not material. They're socially constructed. And this turn, some people find it easier than others, but it is without a doubt the case that humans exist within social structures and social relationships. And to truly understand that, you have to work with that, and you have to work with where we are. Qualitative research is a way to investigate from the lived experience of a person their experience of social reality, which might be very different based on their intersectional location in society. And people scoff at the phrase lived experience, but then they use them because lived experience is a valid way of gathering data. It is not meant to be adhering to the scientific method. It is usually inductive, exploratory, and whatnot. So we are going to discuss, once a researcher, let's say a researcher is interested in understanding the experience of newly elected trans representatives in legislatures or parliaments around the world, then there's no natural science method that would be appropriate to do that kind of exploratory work. But on the other hand, because you're dealing with a lot of people's experiences, language, meaning, values, context, it is pretty laborious work, and it does require a significant amount of rigor. And we're going to look at what tools do social researchers have available to examine their data, qualitative data, in the form of text or images. We'll talk about like we text and talk, right? So we've got images and textual stuff, and then words and what people say and write in this one. So before we go, I just want to say hello to a few people I can see in the chat. Hey Sib, hey DN fan, or DN fan. It is good to see you. I think that's everyone who's chatted so far today. But let's get started. As you can see, there's been a slide waiting for us for a long time on here. And I wanted to set up our ontological, epistemological, what exists, how can we know it, questions, as a way to set the stage for this. Because before I guess it was probably the early to middle part of the 19th century, into the modern era, I guess, you'd have to say, that because a lot of the language developed in the scientific process came out of the natural sciences, and the natural sciences just sort of like used words to describe things and metrics and to measure things and whatnot. They didn't have to reflect too much. I mean, a meter is a meter is a meter. You don't have to really think about it too much. It's completely arbitrary. Like, don't get me wrong. A meter is a social construct. But once you've established the parameters of a meter, you don't have to renegotiate it. It doesn't really change over time. So there's a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like naivete, I guess, in the fact that words can correspond one-to-one onto the world without bringing any values or norms or associations or structures or power structures with it. Sorry. And this perspective, which we're not going to be using, but this perspective is the idea that language is a tool. It's a neutral tool that we use to describe the world of things. There is us and our minds over here, and then there are things around us, a pitcher, a coffee cup, an orange juice. What is this? True fruits. Orange, apple, banana, mango, and I don't know what maracuja is in German. But these things are what they say they are. They are simply descriptors for phenomenon, and we can all generally agree what a door is, or what a roof is, what a house is, and that it's very transparent and simple to find language to describe the world. However, that didn't last. Wittgenstein happened. Well, there was a whole turn. There was this, you can go back in the philosophy of science. There was a very interesting period out of the Vienna Circle where they had a real fascination. The logical positivists really wanted to create precision in language as a critique against Hegelian dialectic language use, and they felt that the Hegelians were very vague and that what they were saying wasn't necessarily meaningful, and they felt, oh, well, we can do meaningful terms, meaningful language because we're scientists. And the thing is, the more they started to look at language, the more it became obvious that language wasn't as simplistic as they thought. So you go from like Wittgenstein's early work on the Tractatus, where he's still very much in that logical positivist, naive view of the simplicity of language as a tool to describe the world. But by the end of his life, he's got a completely different perspective on language. He realized that language is a social construct. And as so, it doesn't have a objective, independent, given meaning in the way that coal is a stable, atomic link between various types of, atoms or whatever. I don't do chemistry, leave me alone. But you understand here the assumption of an objectivity separateness that provides a sense of security for some people, that this is what is real. And that was really taken apart and broken down. Not saying that we can't agree what language is, but just to accept that there is not a natural, given, findable essence of anything that we can use for to capture, to pen in language. So from this other perspective, the naive perspective, I'll call it, language is a neutral tool. And we just use these valueless tools, simple, straightforward, to describe the world around us. The worlds reflect the world we live in. They don't shape it. Language is our tool to describe the world. Our tools do not determine what exists in our world. As we said, that was a rather naive approach to language. And as basically sometimes when you look into something, you think it's going to be simple, and then you realize it's not. It just continues to break down. If you try to, you can undermine it. And Instead, we're going to take the perspective that language is a way that we construct relationships, reality, social reality, and people's lived experiences. That language doesn't have to be, but it certainly can be value laden. And what exists linguistically will shape what people think exists in the world. I will come back to, I think, my most powerful point on how language shapes what constitutes reality by noting that all of the warning for discussion of crimes, sexual crimes. The sexual crimes that are described in the Bible always have a cis woman as the victim. And that victimhood, that notion of being violated and being assaulted, is always tied to the feminine. There is no even space for the idea that a man could be assaulted and be made a victim. And as a consequence, it is very likely that throughout history, men and boys who were victimized were wrongly accused of violating laws and could have been murdered because there wasn't a space to acknowledge that their victimhood was a valid thing that could happen. So understanding that language isn't neutral and that by including and excluding certain categories, it will shape people's lives. You start to respect a bit more the power of language and to not be so naive about its use. All right, so we're going to talk about discourse analysis. What is discourse? I think it's a frustratingly vague term. Oftentimes you'll hear language in use as a way to describe it. I kind of came up with one I liked a little bit better, which is that it's language in use within specific contexts, that it's grounded in values, interconnected to other words and identities and meanings. So we might have a free market discourse, or a new capitalist discourse, or performing gender discourse. This is before Butler. I don't know where Butler is anymore on trans stuff, but this was way, way before trans stuff. So anyway, just note that in my lecture notes. I wasn't quoting Butler. I can't remember where Butler falls on these descriptions. So I really like Gee. I think it's James Gee. He's got some good books on discourse out of Madison, I think the last time I checked. But he wrote, if you put language, action, interaction, values, beliefs, symbols, objects, tools, and places together in such a way that others recognize you as a particular type of who, engaged in a particular type of what, here and now, then you have pulled off a discourse. Here's a super easy way of thinking about the way that we can create identities and activities. If you and I go to a professional sports match, we are not going to be allowed in certain areas of the field or on the pitch, right? In order to be considered a player, you have to meet a series of conditions. You have to be hired by you have to be a professional footballer. You have to be hired by the club. That club, you need to be wearing your kit. You need to be on the roster. There are a whole bunch of conditions that provide you with an exclusive access to getting on the pitch to playing the game or playing, the match that are exclusively to one group of people. Now, and this is a kind of a simplistic way of doing a discourse, but or discussing discourse. But even like the terms around the football pitch and the way that people are describing it, the context, the mentions of previous players or other current players, all of this is involved in this specific type of discourse. And if you don't know the terms and language and history and people, you're going to kind of miss out. There's a lot of contextual stuff being pulled on within it. All right, so then different forms of discourse analysis. In what ways can discourse is like a huge category of stuff. It can be a lot of things. So what are some of the tools that we have, approaches that we can use to get a handle on all of this talk data, all of the stuff that comes out of people's mouth or what they do performatively? One is a conversation analysis. You can study talk in natural settings. And the aim here is to uncover the underlying structures of talk. To do that, though, to uncover the underlying, that's hard to say, to uncover the underlying structures of talk, you have to then, of course, assume talk is structured. In what way is talk structured? Well, people who have more power are going to be able to talk at different times and in different tones and in different ways and to say different things, like giving orders or commands or doling out job duties, than other people. So talk is structured not only in terms of like the back and forth of a conversation, but talk is structured in terms of like where the two actors or multiple actors are located relative to each other. Who gets to talk? That talk is forged contextually. You have to understand the context that people are in to understand who gets to say what and when. And that conversational analysis, like all empirical research, is grounded in the data. So you're not going to speculate on inferential, you're not going to do interpretive stuff. Well, no, you're not going to you're not going to be able to do first principles and deducing down from first principles what happened in a conversation. You need empirical evidence and an empirical grounding. All right. Discourse analysis. Now, this is slightly different because in conversation analysis, you're really looking at how conversations are structured. For instance, you might have examining how bosses speak to their employees and how often employees give a verbal affirmative, like encouraging back to boss based on their gender or gender identity. And maybe you're interested in to see whether or not there are gender and or sex differences interacting in how much people give feedback to the person in power. I'm just making things up, but you understand that conversation, you're looking at the dynamics of a conversation between people. Discourse analysis is broader. It studies the way in which linguistic categories not only refer to objects in the world, but how these categories come to constitute objects. How did we come to, for instance, live in a world of capitalist norms? This is when we talk about market and the economy, we have a whole bunch of tools and terms and assumptions and frameworks. How do we get to the point where this is the language we use? And discourse analysis aims to understand how language constitutes or produces the social world. Critical discourse analysis. And they're like, oh, no, critical discourse. Yeah, this is going to come out of, like a Marxian tradition of analyzing power and analyzing the structure of power and the distribution, who gets power and what. So you don't have to do critical discourse analysis every time you do discourse analysis. You could, for instance, do a discourse analysis on football and the history of football. And maybe you want to look at something, for instance, like the evolution of policies on racism in football in the last 50 years. You can go back and look at documents, you can look at news coverage, you can look at public relations statements and track all this stuff. And you can do it descriptively, right, without any analysis. If you wanted to do a critical discourse analysis, though, you would also want to include maybe the fact that the composition of the teams being, let's assume, I don't think I'd be very wrong here, predominantly, if not exclusively, white men, meant that the issue wasn't taken on as seriously because the people who are affected are not the people who have power. And you might want to look at what were the critical intervention points that made people start to take racism in football more seriously or change their tack or be more aggressive in dealing with it. What were these inflection points or shifts in policy that forced people with power to do something other than what had been done before, relative to the player experiences, maybe to an incident in particular. But anyway, you're going to be looking a lot more about the way that people in power use language or have used this kind of thing, rather than a more like neutral discourse analysis. All right, so as a little example, Foucault studied language as a system of representation, language, and practice. It takes as one of its key subjects the relationship between knowledge, power, and the body in modern society. And it sees knowledge as meshed with in relations of power because it's applied to the regulation of social conduct. So it's an angle about the way that knowledge is used in combination with language and power to shape modern society, and the fact that you can defer to experts or whatever else. So again, it's the important thing about a critical discourse analysis approach is that it's always mindful of power and power relations and hierarchy. And it is highlighting these power relations and hierarchy normally because the hierarchy and power distributions are normalized and accepted as natural. They're not questioned. And the point of critical analysis or critical discourse, any kind of critical theory approach, is to make the invisible visible, to ask questions about why is this structured this way, or point out that it is. Point out that there are gaps, in victim linguistics that allow, predators to get away with things because there isn't a category of victim, that kind of stuff. All right, content analysis. We looked, I think, a little bit at this. It's the most quantsy type of analysis. Content analysis, you're looking at texts, especially newspapers or other transcribed text, in order to empirically document who gets covered, for instance, is a question you could answer in a content analysis. What gets reported and what does not get reported? It's always easy to find the positive end of the spectrum, the thing that exists, but a good social scientist will ask, well, what's missing here? Who doesn't get a voice? Who doesn't get an opportunity to speak? And making a point of making that visible, showing the omissions and who is included in making the decisions or who gets asked, because people in the bubble can't see. Otherwise, they would have asked them. Understand? Like, the point of critical analysis is to make us more aware of things that we weren't aware of. And, there are also ways that you can look at how the type of coverage is shapes what gets covered. So it might be the type of media. And also you might be interested in where do things get covered in a newspaper or on a website, a BBC website. Is it on the front page, the opinion page, and whatnot? I'm currently doing, I don't know if you call it content analysis. It's really more grounded theory, which I'm sure we'll get to. So, okay, there are just a whole bunch of who, what, where, when, why, how questions that you can ask about content analysis. But in the interest of going on, we're gonna move on. Narrative analysis, this is one I've used before in my own research, and I really like it as a form of analysis because it's more holistic, I find, than the other ones we've looked at so far. So far we've looked at discourse analysis, which is fine. Wait. Yeah, discourse analysis, we're looking at basically how language is used, or we're looking at the way power relations interact with like what categories exist and how language is used. We've talked about content analysis. We've also talked about something else, I thought, conversational analysis between individuals. Narrative analysis I like it because it's a bit of an insight into how people think. So in the case of my own research, we had collected stories about people's voting day. Like, post-election, you have fewer questions to ask, really, than pre-election, because people have already made up their minds. And so you're following up with them to find out, like, how they voted, if they're willing to tell you, and what they think about the new government, what they thought about the election, where they think, blah, 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 blah. But one of the things that we asked them was, all right, so, you get up, it's the day of the election, tell me a story about your day and how you ended up deciding for whom you're going to vote. Did you decide months ago? Did you decide the day? Whatever else. And we had several people who were partisans who voted for the same party, and their stories were pretty straightforward. They had very little in the way of narrative drama. It was more like a report. I got up, I watched the news, I took the kids, dropped them off at school, and then on my way to work, I went to vote because it's right by where I work, and it was super easy. British people never complain about that, in my experience, about like having to wait too long at the queues. Generally, I find that they're very efficient in terms of their experiences, reporting their experiences afterwards. And I went in, it was pretty bog standard. I just did my registration thing, got out my pencil, made my little mark. Like, they literally have like little pieces of paper, and put it in the box, and I went about my day. And, then I tuned in the news at 10 o'clock to see what the result was, whatever else, They had very straightforward. There wasn't a lot of drama. People, though, who hadn't made up their mind until before, very close to the election, or sometimes even the day of the election, they'll tell these stories that are all about the drama of them trying to make up their minds. And this was, interesting because when you look at how the two different groups set up their stories, they actually, like told them a little bit differently. There were similarities in the way that people discussed their votes. If they all, whomever they voted for, conservative, liberal, Democrat, or Labor, or Green, or UKIP, or whatever, if they didn't have any conflict, it didn't matter what party they voted for, the stories structurally were very similar. And yet, if they did have a conflict about for whom they were going to vote, or they didn't have a strong partisan identification, so they had to make up they had to come up with a different reason to justify how they voted, there was a different structure of the way they told the stories. And what was most interesting to me, I think, about the narrative analysis is that these are stories of people telling stories about themselves that make them make sense to themselves. In other words, I'm not going to tell you a story that I don't think is plausible. You're going to ask me, how did you vote? I'm not going to say, well, I went into the polling booth and then I felt the space beam of the Martian aircraft beam down through the election hall into my brain, and it took my hand and it forced me to. No one's going to, you're not going to say that, right? So you're giving a story to explain yourself, but also justify your actions. And how people decide to do that, I found, was really super interesting. So if you're interested in reading that piece, it's called I Went With What I Always Did. It's available, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'll look it up. And I don't often promote my own research. I went with what I always did. I think that's the name of it. And is it Winters and Carvalho or Carvalho and Winters? I can't remember. Oh. Oh, I went with what I always do. I was pretty close. I did a slight change in. What is this? The Discovery Dundee thing? Oh, yeah. Okay. It looks like. Is this a draft version? Peer review version? Yeah, it's close enough. So this would be the article. If you have any interest, you can. Let me just check to see if there's another nicer version of that. No, apparently not. Oh, well, okay. Never mind. Where did we get this? I can't remember where we got this published. It's published somewhere. I have to find that. But anyway, you can go and look that up if you want. All right. Guy provides another way of thinking about ways to deal with textual analysis. And that is, it's really still super bright, isn't it? He talks about 7 areas of reality with which are built, that we build through speaking or writing. So a discourse analyst can use these categories to read a document or a transcript, or basically anything that has language in it. So you can go through a piece of writing and or a transcript and ask yourself, what is significance here? What is significant? What do people give meaning or value to in the context of their stories? How is this piece of language being used to make certain things significant or not significant? And how is it being used? So, for instance, if you wanted to do this an analysis on Trump, for instance, you could look at his speeches and identify those things that he signals as being significant, and also you can tell by his omissions sometimes what he's saying is insignificant. And again, it's easy to only see what's there. It's a harder question to ask, what's missing from this text? Where are the gaps? What do I not see? And that's the sign, that's the effort of a really good social researcher, is to be able to see what's not there, not only what is there. Activities. When we act, we might use language to make it clear to others what we're doing. So what activity or activities does a piece of language in use, how is it being used to enact an activity? Again, I can go back to, who can validly be on a football pitch and who cannot. Now, because we claim, a certain role, others don't have to recognize our claims as valid. There are people who still think Donald Trump is really the president of the United States. Clearly, that is not a valid view by the majority. So this is another area where we have to realize that, it's not like something is or isn't. We should notice what isn't, and we also have to recognize that validity is contested. Identities, we use language to get recognized as taking on a certain identity or role. Right now, I am taking on the role of a person with a PhD who knows what she's talking about and is explaining what she knows so that other people can get smarter, right? And I am building that identity with you in the here and now, for instance, when I refer to my own published research. I am enacting this identity, demonstrating my competency and my proficiency in order to establish both credibility and believability. So another question you can ask of a piece of writing or a piece of discourse is, what identity or identities are being used in this language to enact, what identities are being enacted through this use of language? Another thing you can pay attention to is language to signal relationships. There might be a relationship we have with someone. It might be a relationship we want to have or we're trying to have. And it could also be with individuals or a group or even an institution. So if someone says to me, Dr. Winters, can I have a word? Versus Kristi, can I have a word? They're signaling in both instances, their relationship to me or my relationship to them. By using my title, this is affording me a certain level of status that they are incorporating into their question, that they are acknowledging my relationship to them in some way with this title. If they use my first name, that indicates a different relationship. Both are relationships, they're just different in terms of what they signal with regard to the two people talking. So what kind of relationships does a piece of language seek to enact? Is a question you can ask when analyzing text or talk. I can't remember which one it was this time. I think it's talk. Politics, and by politics here we mean the distribution of social goods. Discourse analysis can provide us with a perspective on what social goods are by understanding what kind of values a piece of language is communicating. What is assumed to be normal or right, good or correct, appropriate or valuable, or the way things ought to be, or for instance, like me or not like me. The perspective on a social good that you will hear in a fundamentalist Christian church will be quite different from the discussions on what is a social good in, let's say, like a community organizing group where they're trying to get people involved in a local issue. And paying attention to this and understanding how these normative positions are constructed by the speaker or the values collectively in the group that are being drawn upon to create authenticity or power or authority is what you're doing with discourse analysis. Again, a lot of times it's about making the invisible visible. It's about bringing attention to the things that people do without question to get them to whoa, yeah, actually, this is how this is working. This is how we're doing. This is how we're reproducing racism in our community, for instance. Connections. We use language to connect things. Like I just used, racism to analyze, like a critique of power or whatever I just did. People put things together. And again, we can just look at the fact that they put them together, or we can ask themselves, why did they put these two things together? What is the goal? What is the accomplishment? What are they trying to draw on by linking these things up? Classic, example in the American folk tale of how somehow exclusively male, exclusively white, slave-owning class are the epitome of freedom in America. We do this by making connections between the founders and liberties, and we leave out the connections of all the people they denied liberty to for centuries. We whitewash. We over-universalize what was a racist, sexist, exclusive club that was used violence and the power of the state to enforce it on anyone who disagreed. Right? So we can look at this facade of liberty that is built on a slave-owning patriarchal class, not because they were actually the epitome of liberty. The founders only wanted liberty for white men like them. They didn't care about anybody else. They were racist AF, right? But today, we have transformed the notions of liberty, and we are trying to recover the founding fathers from themselves. We are trying to impute upon them an inspiration that of collective nature of freedom that somehow omits slavery and omits racism and omits Jim Crow and omits all the other stuff that white people did to Black people in America and Native Americans and other minorities in order to build up this lie that we're all equal today. So making connections between things is very important, and discourse analysis is a framework for asking, how does a piece of writing or language connect or disconnect things? How does it make certain things relevant and other things irrelevant? Sign systems and knowledge. So, so we want to get into linguistics and semiotics and signs and everything, although you can with discourse analysis. We're going to try to keep it on the 101 simple level at this point. And I'll just read this out. Sign systems and knowledge. The use of language to make certain signs, symbols, and certain forms of knowledge or belief relevant or privileged in a given situation. I, in this lecture, in this course, make certain forms of knowledge relevant and privileged insofar as understanding what it means to do qualitative research. So I will talk about the methods of constructivist social science and the idea of language as a social construct and reality as a social construct in this situation, because it is the way that I'm promoting the stuff, right? So this is just an example of how I, for instance, privilege a constructivist view when discussing qualitative research, that if I was more of a positive perspective, you would feel a little left out. I don't do a lot of discussion of positivist perspectives here. We're doing a lot of social construction, right? And I'm privileging that because of the fact that we're talking about qual. So you can ask, how does a piece of language privilege or disprivilege specific sign systems? That can be languages like English versus Spanish. It can be the use of technical language versus everyday words. So if you watch a TED talk and the person is dropping a lot of alphabet soup things, and institutions or groups or legislation or regulations, this creates deep distance between you and your audience. And there are some assumptions that you make about who is in the audience and who can understand where you're coming from in that way. Different ways of knowing or believing or different claims to knowledge or belief. So again, these are all from an analytic point of view. Tools of inquiry and discourse. GEES tools can be used to analyze the building tasks, these language building tasks in specific instances. We can look at it in social language. And this is the use of different styles of language to enact and to recognize different identities in different settings. And you can also pay attention to how different social languages are used and mixed in different ways. Discourses are, how do people combine and integrate language, action, interactions, ways of thinking, believing, valuing, and using various symbols, tools, and objects to enact a particular sort of socially recognized identity. I hope you kind of appreciate that the thing about a discourse analysis is it is stepping outside of the bubble. It's that weird thing, like when you're a mathematician and you start to really think about the formulas you're using or the maths or the assumptions behind them. When you start to analyze the use of language with language, it kind of you realize how ephemeral, a lot of the things in society are, that they're really upheld by reproducing language and values over time, not that they have an inherent essence that exists independent of mind. Intertextuality is a phrase I've used a couple times, but it is one that I like a lot because it captures a thing that we do a lot as human beings, but we don't really discuss. And it's references. So does language draw upon other references in order to make connections, cross-references? And intertextuality is an attempt to bring in a whole bunch of other things that are embedded in the culture, or let's just call it culture for right now. You call on that thing that has a whole bunch of other different connected values to it as a shorthand for what you're trying to communicate now. Let me give an example, because I've been watching a lot of Community, right? There are times that Dan Harmon in the series will make a movie reference to something else to give a tone, to make So whether it's the Goodfellas reference in the chicken, the poultry, whatever, the mafia, chicken wings or chicken finger mafia one, or in the paintball one, there are a lot of references to Die Hard and to some Stallone movies and Predator and whatnot, right? So by bringing in these little homages or references, even though we're watching the episode of Community with these particular characters, when we get those references, it brings in a whole other set of context to that particular setting or scene or character interaction that gives it information that we don't have time to get through in the dialogue. So it's a bit of a shorthand. When W. Bush, talked about the axis of evil, he was obviously trying to do a play on, or David Frum was, on the axis of evil, or the Allies and the Axis in the Second World War. So he wanted to basically he wanted to link this from Roosevelt's speech given on after Pearl Harbor, and compared the Axis powers of World War II to modern terror states. And so that's where David Frum, got this phrase, the axis of evil, or incorporated it in there. Other ways you can analyze discourse is conversations, references to public issues, themes, debates, motifs within a society. That's another way that you can look to do analysis. And so we're getting pretty close to the end of how you can analyze text. Althede created a checklist to review for qualitative data sources, and for each, in this case, you want to check for authenticity. Who produced the document? Was it genuine? Why was it produced? Was the author in a position to write authoritatively? Other things that you can analyze besides the text themselves are the authenticity. You can do an assessment, the credibility of being free from error or distortion. Obviously, everyone has their perspectives, but did they get the basic facts right? Is the document representative? Is it typical of its kind? And is there clear evidence of what the meaning of the document is meant to be? Once you kind of start to see things in the data, it is very important that you begin a process of coding in order to start to organize things, observations, to determine whether they're one-offs or whether they're patterns. And in here, you want to use some sort of label. You might have concepts that you're labeling, so phenomenon that you get, or you might have pre-existing categories or some intuitive categories, which are, an abstracted framework which can include two or more concepts. So I'm not going to go too much into this right now, but the point is, when you start to deal with text, whatever it is you're looking for in the data, you need to start to code the data when you observe what you think you're observing, or noting the lack of something that you aren't observing and coding that. Things you can code are the attributes of a category, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to go, let's just keep going right here. Not like if you, I'm really not going to go into the details of like how to create a code book for your coding and your definitions and all of that kind of stuff. And we're not going to get double blind. But the point that I wanted to get across today is just the fact that discourse analysis is really fascinating as a process, as an analytic process of something that we use quite unreflectively. I don't often reflect on the words that I use unless I'm being very particular about what I want to say. I want to be very precise, or I want to convey a specific meaning. And I just really think that a lot of really good work and interesting work can come from whatever approach: conversation analysis, textual analysis. You could do, different kinds of discourse analysis, narrative analysis, in order to take that step back and look at how we use language to communicate with each other and how we use it to construct our social reality. All right, and that's it. I'm out of things to say for this one, although we are going to talk next week a little bit more about this, but we're going to talk instead about, oh, that's not what I wanted. Hold on. Stupid. Just good. Boo! Boo! I despise the fact that academia.edu does not allow me to just kind of easily go back, analyzing text and talk. Stupid edu. All right. There we go. So in this one, we are going to talk, next time, I should say. Next time, we are going to talk about text. And by text, I don't just mean words on paper, but anything that is committed to paper. It can be video, films, and photo. We're going to look at different sources of where you can get text to analyze. And we'll talk then a little bit more about methods of analyzing. Depending on whether or not we have time at the end of this or the second section, or the part 3, I guess you'd call, of this analyzing talk and text. We're going to watch a video called A Date with Your Family, which I found initially from watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, but it's an educational video from the 1950s with a lot of normative assumptions. And I really enjoyed doing these 2 lectures of analyzing talk and analyzing text, and then just showing my students this video, and I say, all right, let's do discourse analysis on this. I want you to watch this, and I want you to note what is being conveyed, what are the goods, what are the bads, and what are the power structures, what are the roles here, how are identities created in this piece of educational material, who is the target audience, who is excluded from this target audience, and that kind of just level of stepping back. I think the students always had a really good time with it, and the video is pretty hilarious, I think, given that we've moved on now 70 years later. All right, I'm gonna dip back in. Hey, Easy7, welcome back. Hope your dinner was good. And I don't see a whole lot of questions, which makes me think you guys have just got me on in the background somewhere. And I'm babbling gently in your ear from somewhere across the room. And that's fine. If you have any questions, you can always drop them, of course, in the Discord as well, which I don't have a new link to because I'm lazy and I have a lot of things to do because today I have to try to kill my players in D&T tonight. So not really, sort of. Not really, just a little bit. Okay. Unless you guys have anything else to say, I'm going to wrap it up for this week. Also, now that we've done a little Social Science Sunday bit and all of my views have gone crashing down, only the hardcore people have stayed around for this. As we gear up toward the November elections, also because I'm going to be heading off to Dundee starting in November, I think I'm going to switch to more election-related stuff after we finish this series of qualitative research methods lectures. And hopefully, I mean, it's not a big deal. It's quality over quantity. I think this is good stuff and people find it interesting. But practice thoughtful listening. Actually, good. Yay, Michael. Nice one, Michael. Yes, you're doing active listening. Nice callback demonstrating you did listen to the lecture. I must have ticked you off after quipping about that short I watched. What? I don't know what you're talking about. Sorry, Sib, I don't know. But this short I've used for like the last 10 years in my lectures. But if you have another one to recommend, please do. Liking the topic, got my brain working. All right, Poe Mama Sid. Yes, definitely. I think, discourse analysis it can be overwhelming because it's a lot of text and language and stuff, but it can also be very illuminating. And if you are interested, I guess I can do this. One thing I can recommend is oh no. My hold on, I have to plug in my mouse. Oh, that's not gonna work. Oh, I'm running out of power slots. Hold on. My mouse died. My mouse battery died, so I have to plug it back in. If you are interested in nerding out a little bit more about the use of language and the philosophy of language, especially in terms of evolving from the Vienna Circle and the logical positivist attempt to really quantify and almost strip language of systematizing it, I would recommend it's Brian McGee, Philosophy of Language. Look at that. Look, it's a nerdy prompt. Yes, John Searle and Brian McGee. They also do another one. Here's with Bernard Williams. But any of those are going to be really great. I watched the one with Searle. John Searle is a very famous philosophy of language or philosopher of some type. I don't know exactly. He's got a great book called The Reality of Social Construction, which is different from The Construction of Social Reality by Bergman and Luckman. But here, The New Realism. Searle is really great. He's really, really good. And yes, I'm definitely going to have to, sorry, Sibby, I'm definitely going to have to get warm. I'm going to bring lots of fuzzy socks, heavy, thick, woolen fuzzy socks with me when I go to Scotland, because I've seen how your floors, the floors get cold. All right, there's a little Brian McGee philosophy of language nerdiness for you back in the day. But until next time, all that's left to be said is that I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I do appreciate it that you, come by and spend your time with me. Move my camera in the very last bit here. And, have a great Sunday or a great weekend, a great week. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe, wherever it is and whenever it is you are. Okay, till next time. Oh, no, I didn't do the thing where I organized my YouTube stuff to get the right button. Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. All right, talk to you later. Bye.